The peaceful Sarathian homeworld stood under the starry sky, bathed in the soft glow of distant suns. The lush green planet was a symbol of harmony, a place where nature and civilization coexisted in perfect balance. But for the last few years, that peace had been slowly eroding. A rebel faction, led by a group of radical Sarathians, had begun to stir trouble. What started as small protests and disagreements had quickly escalated into full-scale violence. The peaceful government struggled to maintain control, and the rebellion grew stronger by the day. The Sarathians, known across the galaxy for their wisdom and diplomacy, had reached a breaking point. In desperation, the Sarathians sent out a distress signal, calling for help from the greater galactic community. They didn't want a war. They didn't want to fight. What they needed, they said, was peacekeepers. Individuals who could come to their world and mediate, guiding them through the conflict with calm words and peaceful solutions. A diplomatic solution was their only hope. The message traveled across light years, reaching the ears of many in the galaxy. But it was not just any response that came back. Across the stars, the Terran fleet received the call. The humans, a race, known for their resilience and strength, were no strangers to conflict. Their home, Earth, was a world shaped by centuries of war, survival, and struggle. They had earned the nickname Deathworlders, and it was not one they took lightly. Captain Cale Mitchell of the Terran Peacekeeping Force looked at the message from the Sarathians with a mixture of concern and anticipation. He stood in the AE command center of the Terran flagship, the Dawn's Fury, his broad shoulders and stern expression a testament to his years of service. His crew, an elite group of soldiers, were skilled in more than just diplomacy. They had faced wars and enemies from the farthest reaches of the galaxy, surviving where others would have perished, and they had always emerged victorious. The Sarathians are a peaceful race, Mitchell muttered, his voice low. But this rebellion, it's no small matter. They want peace, but they've called the wrong kind of help. Mitchell's second-in-command, Lieutenant Sarah Griffin, looked over the message again. Sir, the Sarathians are asking for peacekeepers. They need our help to bring order, but they don't know what they're asking for, do they? Mitchell sighed. He had always believed in the power of diplomacy, but humanity's reputation as warriors preceded them. When the Terrans were called to mediate, they didn't come unarmed. They came ready to fight, if necessary. But that was not what the Sarathians had envisioned. They were hoping for a peaceful resolution, not soldiers with weapons that could tear down entire cities. They asked for help, Mitchell said, his voice firm, and we'll give it to them, but we'll do it our way. The Terran fleet was a sight to behold, a massive collection of warships and transport vessels that had been built over decades of conflict. Their technology was far more advanced than the Sarathians, and their reputation for surviving even the most hostile environments in the galaxy was unmatched. They were known for their toughness, their unyielding will to survive, and their willingness to take action when others hesitated. Within hours, the fleet set course for the Sarathian system, crossing the vast emptiness of space. As the ships traveled, Mitchell and his team prepared for what awaited them. They didn't know exactly what to expect. The Sarathians were a peaceful race, but the rebellion was not something they could ignore. The humans had to be ready for anything. When the fleet arrived in orbit around the Sarathian planet, Mitchell stood at the helm, looking out over the peaceful world below. It seemed so serene from above, but he knew better than anyone that looks could be deceiving. There was a storm brewing down there, and he had no doubt that his team would be at the center of it. Prepare to land, Mitchell ordered. We'll meet with the Sarathian leaders and see what kind of assistance they need. But be ready. I don't trust that everything is as simple as it seems. As the Terran transport ships descended toward the surface, the Sarathian capital city came into view. The city was a blend of nature and technology, with towering buildings that seemed to grow from the ground, their glass surfaces reflecting the blue sky. The people below looked up, curious but cautious, as the human ships touched down. They had never seen humans before, and now they would face them in a way they never anticipated. The Sarathian leaders, dignified and calm, awaited their arrival. They were a race known for their wisdom and patience, and they greeted the Terrans with a mixture of hope and apprehension. The Sarathians had long believed in peaceful negotiation, but the rebels had left them with no other choice. "We are grateful for your help," said High Ambassador Lyra, a tall and elegant Sarathian with pale green skin and silver eyes. "But we must ask, are you truly peacekeepers, or are you soldiers? Our people have no wish for war." Mitchell stepped forward, his expression stern but respectful. "We're here to help," he said, his voice calm but carrying the weight of experience. "But we will not stand by if your people are in danger. If it comes to that, we will act." The Sarathians exchanged uneasy glances. They had hoped for a peaceful solution, but they feared what the humans might bring with them. Peacekeepers they may be, but Terrans were known for their strength, and it was clear that their kind of peace was not one of quiet negotiations. "We have no choice," Ambassador Lyra said softly. "Our people are at war. We hope that you can help us find another way." Mitchell nodded. "We'll do our best. But be prepared. Peace isn't always the outcome when you're facing enemies that won't listen." As the humans and Sarathians discussed their options, the sky above, the city darkened. The winds of change were blowing, and in the distance the sound of rebellion echoed across the world. The humans had arrived, but it was clear that this would not be a peaceful resolution. Not yet. The Sarathian city was alive with anticipation as the Terran peacekeepers made their way through the streets. The air was thick with a sense of unease. The people watched the human soldiers carefully as they moved in perfect formation, their heavy boots thudding on the ground with a confidence that only years of survival on harsh worlds could bring. There was no mistaking it. The humans had arrived ready for something much more than simple peacekeeping. As they approached the Sarathian Council Hall, the tension grew. Ambassador Lyra, the Sarathian leader who had first called for help, greeted Captain Cale Mitchell with a polite smile, though her eyes betrayed a sense of worry. She had hoped that the Terrans would bring with them the peace they so desperately needed, but the sight of their battle-ready uniforms and powerful weapons made her question what kind of help they could truly offer. "We are honored by your presence, Captain Mitchell," she said, her voice smooth but strained. "But I must ask, are you certain that your people are the ones to help us? We asked for peacekeepers, not warriors." Mitchell's eyes locked with hers, his expression firm but understanding. He had dealt with situations like this before, places where peace was only a fleeting dream. But he knew that sometimes peace had to be fought for. He wasn't about to sugarcoat the situation. "We are peacekeepers, Ambassador," he said, his voice calm but unwavering. "But we don't shy away from what's necessary. You called for help, and we will do whatever it takes to restore order." Behind Mitchell, his team stood ready, every soldier's face a mask of quiet determination. They were a group of highly trained individuals, each one an expert in combat, survival, and negotiation. But they knew that their training would be put to the test here. The Sarathians were unlike any enemies they had faced before. These were people who valued peace above all else. The humans had to find a way to navigate that. The council hall was a massive structure, built with glass walls that allowed the serene green landscape of the city to be visible from every room. Inside, the Sarathian leaders gathered, their expressions a mixture of hope and doubt. They had sent for the Terrans because they were their last hope, but as they looked at the human soldiers, they couldn't help but feel a sense of dread. These were not the peacemakers they had imagined. They were warriors, and the power in their eyes made it clear that if things came to a fight, the humans would be ready. The Sarathians had tried every peaceful method they could think of to quell the rebellion. They had sent diplomats, offered compromises, and promised reforms. But nothing had worked. The rebels grew stronger, and now there was no turning back. The peaceful Sarathians were being pushed to their limits. Lyra spoke again, her voice quiet, but filled with the weight of her people's fear. "We have a long history of peace, Captain. We have always believed in the power of dialogue. But these rebels, they refuse to listen. They've taken up arms, and they have no intention of negotiating." Mitchell nodded. "We understand. We'll help you deal with the rebels. But first, we need to know exactly what we're dealing with. Where are they based?" Lyra hesitated, looking at the other Sarathian leaders around her. The question was a sensitive one. The rebels had infiltrated many parts of the planet, and the government had lost control over several key regions. They had no choice but to rely on the Terrans for help, even if it meant sacrificing some of their ideals. "There are several strongholds," Lyra said finally, "but the largest is in the capital's outskirts, deep within the forested regions. They've fortified themselves there, and it's almost impossible to reach them without facing heavy resistance." Mitchell's eyes narrowed as he took in the information. The rebel stronghold was deep in the forests, a place where the Sarathians had always kept their natural environment intact. The idea of fighting there, in the very heart of their peaceful world, didn't sit well with him. But he had no choice. The rebels had pushed the Sarathians into a corner. "We'll prepare a plan," Mitchell said. "But first, we need to meet with your people. We need to make sure they understand that we're here to help, not harm." Lyra nodded, though she wasn't sure how much more of her people's ideals could withstand the storm that was coming. The rebels had already proven that they were willing to fight, and now the humans, with their intimidating strength, were here to do the same. But deep down, she knew she had no other option. As they left the council hall and made their way to a nearby public square, the Sarathians watched warily. Some of them seemed hopeful, but many more looked nervous. They had always been a peaceful people, and the sight of human soldiers marching through their streets was unsettling. The humans carried weapons, guns, rifles, and tools designed for war. But there was something else about them that made the Sarathians uneasy. The confidence in their eyes. They were ready for whatever came next. Mitchell and his team stopped in the middle of the square facing the crowd. The humans had been briefed about their mission, but this was the first time they would speak directly to the Sarathian people. "We're here to help," Mitchell said, his voice booming through the square. "We know that you value peace above all else. We do too. But sometimes peace has to be earned, and we're willing to fight for it," the crowd murmured. There were whispers of concern, and some Sarathians looked away, unable to meet Mitchell's gaze. But there were others who stood tall, their eyes filled with a quiet sense of hope. Maybe the humans could do what they could not. Mitchell took a step forward, his eyes sweeping over the crowd. "We won't abandon you," he said. "But you must understand. Our methods are not like yours. If you want peace, you must be willing to stand with us. Together, we will bring this rebellion to an end." For a moment, the square was silent. Then, a single voice from the crowd spoke up. "And if we don't want war?" a young Sarathian asked. "If we want to find another way?" Mitchell looked at the young Sarathian, his face softening for just a moment. "I understand," he said. "But sometimes, peace comes at a price. We'll do everything we can to minimize that price. But if it comes to a fight, we will be ready." The crowd fell silent again. There was no more arguing, no more questioning. The humans had arrived, and they had made it clear that they would stop at nothing to restore peace. But at what cost? The Sarathians could only hope that the humans' strength would bring them the peace they so desperately needed. The days following the arrival of the Terran Peacekeepers were filled with both action and uncertainty. Captain Mitchell and his team worked closely with the Sarathians, gathering intelligence about the rebels and their strongholds. The Terran, soldiers, though known for their battle readiness, did their best to respect the Sarathians' desire for peace. But the truth was undeniable. The rebellion was growing stronger, and the Sarathian government was losing control. One morning, as the team gathered in the command center, Mitchell stood before a large holographic map of the Sarathian planet. The image displayed the planet's cities, forests, and mountains, along with the locations of the rebel forces. "The rebellion is spreading faster than we expected," Mitchell said, his voice steady but grim. "The rebels have taken control of 3 more cities. We can't wait any longer. It's time to act." Lieutenant Griffin stepped forward, her brow furrowed as she studied the map. "They're pushing the government forces back, Captain. If we don't intervene soon, we'll be facing a full-scale war. We have to make a move before it gets worse." Mitchell nodded. "Agreed. But we need to do this carefully. We're not here to destroy the planet. We're here to restore order. We'll approach this strategically using both force and diplomacy." The plan was set. The humans would first make contact with the leaders of the rebel faction, hoping to negotiate a peaceful surrender. However, if that failed, they would be forced to take a more direct approach. The team knew that the Sarathians had never experienced a war on their homeworld, and the consequences of battle would be devastating. Meanwhile, the Sarathian government, led by Ambassador Lyra, continued to work behind the scenes to try and broker a ceasefire. She had always believed in the power of peaceful negotiation, but the rebels were not interested in listening. The situation had grown desperate. She feared that if they didn't find a way to end the violence soon, the planet's future would be in jeopardy. "I never imagined it would come to this," Lyra confessed to Mitchell one evening as they stood on the balcony of the council hall, looking out over the city. "Our people have always been diplomats. We've never had to fight for peace. And now, we're at war." Mitchell glanced at her, his expression softening. He had seen this kind of fear before, on countless planets where peaceful races were caught in the crossfire of conflict. He understood her pain. It was hard to imagine a world like the Sarathian homeworld being torn apart by violence. But he also knew that sometimes peace could only be restored through strength. "I know this is difficult," Mitchell said quietly. "But you called for help. We're here to help you, not destroy your world. We'll find a way to end this." Lyra nodded, though doubt lingered in her eyes. "I hope you're right, Captain. But I fear that the longer this war goes on, the more it will change us. The Sarathians have always valued peace, but that may no longer be enough." As they discussed their plans, a sudden alarm sounded throughout the city. The holographic map flashed red, indicating that the rebels had launched a full-scale attack on one of the last remaining government-controlled cities. The situation had escalated far beyond their control. The government forces were overwhelmed, and the rebels were closing in on the capital. "Captain, the rebels are advancing," Griffin said, urgency in her voice. "We need to move now." Mitchell's expression hardened. "Get the team ready. We're going in." The Terran Peacekeepers quickly mobilized, preparing their weapons and equipment. They were not soldiers of war, but they were trained to act when necessary. The city was in chaos as the rebel forces clashed with government soldiers in the streets. The Terrans moved swiftly, providing cover for the Sarathian soldiers and pushing back the rebels where they could. The fight was intense, but the humans' training and firepower made them a formidable force. Mitchell and his team led the charge, working in perfect coordination. As they moved through the city, the rebels, caught off guard by the humans' advanced weaponry, fell back. But it was clear that the battle was far from over. The humans were here to fight, but they were also here to protect. They couldn't afford to let the Sarathians' home be destroyed. The battle raged for hours, but finally, the humans reached the central command center of the rebel forces. Mitchell and Griffin exchanged a look, both knowing that the most important part of their mission was yet to come. "We need to negotiate," Mitchell said, his voice low. "We can't fight forever. We need to stop this before more lives are lost." The rebels had set up a stronghold in the heart of the city, a once beautiful park that had now been turned into a battleground. The humans and Sarathians made their way into the park, where the rebel leader, a tall and fierce Sarathian named Varek, awaited them. He stood with his arms crossed, his eyes cold and unyielding. "You're too late, Terrans," Varek sneered. "Your peacekeepers won't. Save this planet. We will never surrender." Mitchell stepped forward, his voice calm but firm. "You're wrong, Varek. This planet has already suffered enough. We're here to stop the bloodshed. Surrender now, and we can work toward a peaceful future. But if you continue to fight, it will only bring more destruction." Varek's eyes flashed with anger, but there was a flicker of doubt in his expression. The battle had taken a toll on his forces, and they were beginning to realize that the humans weren't just another enemy. They were an unstoppable force. "You can't win this war," Mitchell continued, "but we can end it. Together." For a moment, there was silence. The sound of distant gunfire echoed in the background, reminding them all of the high stakes. Varek looked at his rebels, his eyes filled with uncertainty. He had never expected to be forced into this position, to face the humans and their overwhelming strength. But just as the tension reached its peak, the rebel leader took a deep breath. He stepped back and lowered his weapon, signaling his troops to do the same. "You've won," Varek said quietly. "We'll surrender. But know this, our people will never forget what you did here." Mitchell nodded, his expression serious. "This isn't about being remembered. It's about saving lives. And we'll do everything we can to make sure this never happens again." The Sarathian crisis had been averted, but the cost was high. The planet had been scarred by the conflict, and the Sarathians would never be the same. But for the first time in a long while, there was hope that peace could once again return to their world. The battle had ended, and the dust was slowly settling over the Sarathian capital. The once peaceful streets were now scarred with the marks of war, burned buildings, shattered windows, and the unmistakable remnants of the conflict that had almost torn the planet apart. The rebel forces had surrendered, but the victory was bittersweet. The peace that the Sarathians had longed for now seemed farther away than ever. Captain Cale Mitchell stood on the balcony of the Sarathian Council hall looking out over the city. The sun was setting, casting long shadows over the broken streets. His expression was grim, reflecting the toll that the day's events had taken on him. He had led his team into battle, and they had fought hard. But the cost of that victory was clear. The Sarathians, once a peaceful race, had been forced into a conflict they never wanted. The humans had saved them, but at what price? Lieutenant Sarah Griffin approached, her footsteps soft on the marble floor. "Captain, the Sarathians want to speak with you," she said, her voice calm but tired. "They're ready to discuss the future." Mitchell nodded slowly. "I know, but the future doesn't look as bright as it did before we got here." Griffin didn't argue. She knew what he meant. The humans had come to Serath to help, to restore peace, but the very nature of their involvement had changed the planet forever. The Sarathians were no longer the peaceful diplomats they had once been. They had seen war, and the scars would remain long after the humans left. Inside the council hall, Ambassador Lyra and the other Sarathian leaders waited. The room was quieter than usual, the air heavy with the weight of everything that had happened. There was no celebration, no cheering for the victory that had been won. The Sarathians had always valued peace, but now they were left wondering if it had been worth it. Lyra stood as Mitchell entered, her face a mixture of gratitude and sadness. "Captain Mitchell, we owe you a debt we cannot repay," she began, her voice steady despite the emotions beneath. "You and your people have saved us from destruction, but in doing so, we have lost something precious." Mitchell didn't Speak immediately." He understood what she meant. The war had taken its toll on the Sarathian people, and no amount of help could undo the damage. He had led them to victory, but he had also led them to a place where they would have to rebuild not just their cities, but their very identity. "I know," Mitchell said quietly. "You didn't ask for war. You called for peace, and we brought you our way of peace, but peace sometimes comes with a cost." Lyra looked at him, her eyes filled with the pain of what had happened. "I fear we may never be the same again. We have always valued peace, but now, after the conflict, I wonder if that's enough. Our people are not the same as they were before the war." Mitchell's gaze softened. "No one can go through something like this and remain unchanged. You've seen war, and it has changed you. But that doesn't mean the peace you once valued is gone. You can rebuild it slowly, in your own way. The road won't be easy, but it's still there." Lyra nodded, though doubt still lingered in her eyes. "And the price of peace?" she asked quietly. "How do we live with the knowledge that we've had to resort to violence to protect ourselves?" The question hung in the air, unanswered. Mitchell understood that, despite the surrender of the rebels, the Sarathians were struggling with the morality of the situation. They had always believed in diplomacy, in peaceful negotiation. But now, they had seen the destruction that violence could bring, and they had been forced to fight back. "The price of peace is different for everyone," Mitchell replied. "You didn't want war, but sometimes when you fight for what you believe in, it's the only way to ensure survival. The key is to find a way to heal from it, to rebuild what was lost." The room was silent as everyone absorbed his words. The Sarathians had fought hard to protect their way of life, but now they had to find a way to rebuild it. They couldn't erase the scars, but they could move forward. The humans had shown them that strength could be used to protect, not just destroy. After a long pause, Lyra spoke again. "What happens now? What will we do now that the rebellion is over?" Mitchell stepped forward, his expression resolute. "Now, you rebuild. You'll have to come to terms with what happened, but you don't have to do it alone. The Terrans will remain here for as long as you need us. We'll help you rebuild your cities, your infrastructure, and most importantly, your trust. But the Sarathian people must take the lead. You've learned a hard lesson, but you can use that to become stronger." Griffin, who had been standing quietly beside Mitchell, nodded in agreement. "We'll support you, Ambassador, but the true strength of Sarath lies in its people. You've shown incredible resilience, and now you have the opportunity to rebuild. This time with the knowledge that you can defend yourselves." Lyra gave a small, weary smile. "I hope we can rebuild, Captain. I hope we can find a way to restore the peace we once had, even if it will never be exactly the same." "We will," Mitchell replied firmly. "You have the strength. You'll find a new path, one that still honors your past, but also embraces the changes that have come. It won't be easy, but it's possible." The conversation shifted to practical matters, as the humans began planning for their continued assistance in the rebuilding process. It was clear that the Sarathians would need time, and the Terrans were willing to give it. They would provide resources, technology, and manpower to help the Sarathians rebuild their world, but the journey forward would be one that the Sarathians would have to lead. As Mitchell left the council hall, he felt a strange sense of resolve. The mission had been difficult, and it wasn't over yet. The humans had come to Sarath to help, but they had also changed the planet forever. They had brought their strength to bear, and in doing so, they had forced the Sarathians to confront the true meaning of peace. For Mitchell, the question of peace and war was something he would carry with him long after he left Sarath. The humans had come to fight for peace, but they had learned just how complicated that fight could be. And in the end, it was the Sarathians who would have to decide what kind of peace they wanted to build, one shaped by the events of the past, or one that looked toward the future. Days passed since the surrender of the rebel forces, but peace still felt fragile on Sarath. The humans had done their part to protect the Sarathian people, but the scars of war were still fresh. Buildings were being rebuilt, and many of the Sarathian citizens had returned to their daily lives trying to pick up the pieces. But there was still an underlying tension in the air, as if the planet itself was holding its breath, unsure whether peace would truly settle in, or if another storm was looming on the horizon. Captain Kyle Mitchell stood at the balcony of the Terran headquarters, his eyes scanning the horizon. The once quiet city now had the hum of reconstruction, but the memories of the battle still haunted the streets. For the humans, the work was far from over. The Sarathians had made it clear that they appreciated the help, but there was always an unspoken question. What would happen next? Would they need to fight again? Or had the Terran's strength been enough to change the course of Sarathian history? Lieutenant Sarah Griffin entered the room, breaking his thoughts. "Captain, we've received word that the last pockets of rebel resistance have begun to move again. They're not gone yet." Mitchell didn't flinch, though his expression grew serious. He had expected this. Even after the rebellion was over, some of the rebels couldn't let go of their cause. They didn't believe in the peace the Sarathians and the Terrans were trying to build. Mitchell had always known that victory wasn't the end. It was just the beginning of the real work. "Where are they?" Mitchell asked, his voice steady. "Near the eastern borders, in a mountain range," Griffin replied. "It looks like they've rallied a small force again. They might be planning something big." Mitchell sighed, rubbing his hand over his face. "We'll handle it. Prepare the team." The next morning, the Terran Peacekeepers moved out. They were no longer just peacekeepers. They were warriors, and they had proven it. Now they had to face the remnants of a rebellion that refused to accept the new order. The plan was simple: find the rebel stronghold, neutralize the threat, and restore stability to the region. But Mitchell knew that simple plans often went awry. As the team made their way through the rugged terrain of the Sarathian mountains, the atmosphere shifted. The once lush and peaceful landscape was now marred by the signs of the rebellion. Burned-out villages, abandoned farms, and deep scars in the land where battles had been fought. Everything seemed to tell the same story. The Sarathian people had fought for peace, and the rebels had fought for something else. But neither side had truly won. The question now was whether the rebels could ever accept the peace they had been given, or whether they would continue to fight until the end. "Captain, we've got movement up ahead," Griffin said, her voice sharp. "Looks like they're setting up an ambush." Mitchell's heart skipped a beat. He had known this wouldn't be an easy mission, but he didn't expect the rebels to be this bold. He motioned for his team to stop. "We'll take the high ground," Mitchell ordered, his voice calm but firm. "Griffin, you and Sergeant Daniels flank to the left. I'll lead the rest around the right. We need to surround them." The team moved quickly, taking positions in the rocky outcrops that dotted the mountainside. They could see the rebel forces below, moving in and out of the trees, preparing for an ambush. But they had underestimated the humans. The Terrans were. Used to environments like this, treacherous, dangerous, and unforgiving. It was where they thrived. The silence of the mountains was broken by the crackle of weapons being readied. Mitchell signaled for his team to move. They were almost in position when a loud explosion rang out. The rebels had set off an ambush, but it was too late. The humans were already in position, and their counterattack was swift and brutal. The battle was fierce, but the rebels were no match for the Terrans. The humans moved with precision, coordinating their attacks in a way that left no room for error. The rebels, despite their fierce resolve, couldn't withstand the Terrans' superior tactics and technology. The fight didn't last long, and soon the rebel forces were broken, retreating into the mountains once more. But Mitchell didn't celebrate. He knew that victory here wouldn't bring peace. It was just one more battle in a long war, a war That wasn't just about weapons or soldiers. It was about the hearts and minds of the Scifian people. And as long as there were those who resisted, there could be no true peace. As the team gathered after the battle, Mitchell felt the weight of the situation pressing down on him. The rebels had been defeated, but there was still more work to be done. He couldn't afford to let his guard down. The rebels would return, and when they did, the humans would need to be ready. Griffin approached him, her expression thoughtful. "Captain, we've won the battle, but I don't think we've won the war." Mitchell nodded. "I know. The war isn't just about fighting the rebels. It's about changing minds. It's about showing the Sarathians that peace isn't a weakness. And it's about showing the rebels that there's nothing left to fight for." "What now?" Griffin asked. "We continue the mission," Mitchell said, his voice firm. "We'll stay here, support the Sarathians, and help them rebuild. We'll keep fighting, not just with weapons, but with words. We'll remind the Sarathians that they are not alone, and we'll help the rebels see that their war is over." The team made their way back to the Sarathian capital, their heads held high, but their hearts heavy. The battle was over, but the true fight was just beginning. The people of Sarath had been through so much, and Mitchell knew that it would take time for them to heal. The Sarathians had learned the hard way that peace was not something that could be given. It had to be earned, and for that, they would need to stand together. As Mitchell looked out over the city, he knew that peace was still possible. It wouldn't be easy, and it wouldn't come quickly. But with determination, patience, and the strength of those willing to fight for it, the Sarathians would find their way, and the humans would be there to help them every step of the way. The weeks after the final battle were filled with a sense of quiet rebuilding. The Terran Peacekeepers had helped the Sarathians secure the last of the rebel forces, but the true work was just beginning. There were still broken cities to repair, families displaced by the fighting, and memories of violence that could never be erased. The question of peace lingered heavily in the air. Could the Sarathians truly find their way back to the life they had once known? Captain Cale Mitchell stood on the balcony of the command center, looking out over the capital city. The streets, once filled with the sounds of battle, now buzzed with the quiet hum of construction. Workers filled the streets, rebuilding homes, businesses, and government buildings. The signs of war were still present: burned-out vehicles, cracked walls, and broken windows, but there was also a sense of hope. The Sarathians had survived the conflict, and they were moving forward. But it was clear that the cost of peace was more than anyone had expected. Lieutenant Sarah Griffin approached, carrying a datapad in her hands. "Captain, there's an update from the Sarathian leadership," she said, her voice a mixture of professionalism and weariness. "They want to meet with you." Mitchell nodded and turned toward the door. "Let's go. It's time to see what comes next." Inside the Sarathian Council Hall, Ambassador Lyra waited for them. The atmosphere in the room was somber but calm. The last of the rebel forces had been dealt with, but the real challenge lay in how to move forward. The Sarathian leaders had been working tirelessly to rebuild their society, but they knew that the road ahead would be long and difficult. "Captain Mitchell, thank you for joining us," Lyra said, her voice soft but steady. "We've made great progress in the past few weeks, but there is still much work to be done. Our people are struggling, and we know that we must come together if we are to restore what was lost." Mitchell sat down at the table, his eyes meeting Lyra's. He could see the weariness in her expression. The weight of leadership was clear on her face. "We've done everything we can to help, Ambassador," he said. "But now it's up to you and your people to decide what comes next. The Terrans will continue to support you, but the real strength lies within the Sarathian people." Lyra nodded slowly, her fingers resting lightly on the table. "We understand that, but the question remains, what kind of peace can we have after everything that's happened? We've lost so much, and in doing so, we've changed in ways that may never be undone." Mitchell looked out the window at the city below, his thoughts turning inward. He understood her concerns. Peace was never simple. It was a process, one that involved healing, forgiveness, and rebuilding. The Sarathians had lost their innocence, but they still had the potential to find a new way forward. They had to decide what they wanted that future to look like. "I don't have all the answers, Ambassador," Mitchell said, his voice thoughtful. "But I do know this. Peace is never about erasing the past. It's about learning from it and finding a way to build something better. You've already proven that your people have the strength to survive. Now you just need to decide what kind of society you want to create." There was silence in the room as the Sarathian leaders considered his words. Lyra's eyes softened. "Perhaps you're right," she said quietly. "But how do we begin? How do we move forward when so much has been lost?" Griffin stepped forward, offering a suggestion. "Start with your people, the ones who've suffered the most, the families who lost loved ones, the ones who had their homes destroyed. Bring them together. Help them heal. It's going to take time, but the first step is always the hardest." Mitchell agreed. "You can't do it alone, but you also don't have to wait for someone else to show you the way. The Terrans will be here to help, but the heart of Serath lies in its people. You have to rebuild trust, rebuild relationships. That's where peace begins." Lyra nodded slowly, taking in their words. "We will do our best. We know it won't be easy. But perhaps, with time, we can restore the peace we once knew." Over the following weeks, the Sarathians began their process of healing. The government, with the help of the Terran Peacekeepers, started initiatives to support families affected by the war. Reconstruction efforts were ramped up, and community leaders began holding gatherings to promote unity and cooperation. The Sarathians realized that while the scars of war would never fade, they had the power to determine their future. The humans remained on Sarath, assisting with the rebuilding and offering guidance where needed. The Terrans understood that their mission was far from over. Their presence was still necessary, not just for physical support, but for the emotional healing that would take years. The people of Sarath had seen the worst of conflict, and now it was up to them to rebuild their society from the ashes. For Mitchell, the journey was both fulfilling and difficult. He had come to Sarath to help restore peace, but he had learned that peace wasn't something that could be delivered with force. It was something that had to be built, step by step, by people who were willing to face their past and move forward together. As he looked out over the city, he knew that the Sarathians would find their way. It wouldn't be easy, but they had the strength to persevere. Months passed, and the Sarathians began to find their footing again. The wounds of war began to heal, not because the scars disappeared, but because the people learned to live with them. They found new ways to honor their past while building a future that embraced change. It was a delicate balance, but one that they would continue to strive for. The humans, too, had changed. The Terrans had come to Sarath with the belief that their strength and military prowess could solve any problem. But they had learned that true peace wasn't about being the strongest. It was about knowing when to fight and when to help. It was about listening, understanding, and offering support when it was needed most. As Mitchell stood on the balcony once more, looking out over the city, he felt a sense of quiet pride. The Sarathians had found their way, and the humans had played a part in that journey, not as conquerors, but as allies. The mission had been difficult, but in the end, it had been worth it. The peace they had fought for was fragile, but it was real, and with time, it would grow stronger.